I had spent the morning doing what I always did when I had nowhere to be, moving through the house with the same quiet precision that had kept me employed for 3 decades, wiping already clean counters, aligning the shoes by the door, checking the locks twice even though I knew they were fine, because habit doesn't retire when you do. Lauren was supposed to be gone until Sunday night. For days at some spiritual leadership retreat she'd signed up for with a group from her yoga studio. Something about reconnecting with intention and silence, which I'd nodded through because it didn't affect my routines. The house had that temporary, echoing calm it always had when she was away. No music playing in the background. No half-drunk mugs of tea migrating from room to room. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the faint tick of clock over the stove that I'd been meaning to replace for years. I was folding towels when I heard the garage door open, a sound so out of place that my hands froze mid-motion, because Lauren's car wasn't due back for another 72 hours, and I knew the sound well enough to tell when it was hers. I told myself it was a neighbor, or that I miscounted the days. But then the door from the garage opened, and there she was, standing too straight, smiling too quickly, holding a rolling suitcase I had never seen before. It was larger than the one she usually traveled with and scuffed along the edges like it had been dragged across more than a retreat center parking lot. She said hi in the same tone she used when greeting strangers, overly calm, like she was introducing herself to the house rather than coming home to it. And before she even crossed the threshold, I noticed the smell. Not her usual lavender soap or the eucalyptus oil she was obsessed with lately, but something sharper, expensive, unfamiliar, the kind of cologne you notice because it doesn't belong. She launched into an explanation immediately, words stacked too neatly on top of each other, talking about how the retreat ended early, how there was a schedule change, how it felt right to come home sooner, all delivered with rehearsed smoothness that set off alarms in my head I didn't know I still had. People who are telling the truth don't rush to fill silence, and they don't look past you while they're doing it, scanning for exits that don't exist. I watched her hands as she spoke, how they tightened around the handle of the suitcase, how her wedding ring caught the light when she gestured, and I realized I didn't need to ask a single question to know that whatever she'd practiced saying had already failed. The retreat paperwork was still pinned to the fridge with a magnet, clearly stating the end date. Her phone buzzed once in her pocket, and she flinched like she touched a live wire, and in that moment the house felt smaller than it ever had. Every carefully maintained surface suddenly irrelevant. I didn't raise my voice or accuse her of anything. Because I didn't need to. The story had collapsed under its own weight the second she walked in, carrying proof that she'd been somewhere else entirely. And all I could think was how strange it was that after a lifetime of enforcing safety protocols and investigating incidents, the most obvious breach I'd ever seen was standing in my kitchen, smiling at me, pretending nothing had gone wrong. Lauren knew something was wrong before she even set the suitcase down, and I could see it in the way her eyes moved through the house. Not casually, but with a quick, inventory-taking scan of someone whose senses lost before understanding it. The calendar that had always hung by the pantry door, crowded with her color-coded reminders and affirmations, was gone, leaving behind a clean rectangle on the wall where the paint hadn't faded yet. The framed wellness certificate she lined up along the hallway, proof of every course and retreat she'd ever completed, were missing too, the nails still there but empty, like punctuation marks at the end of a sentence that no longer existed. Even the walls looked different. Freshly painted in the neutral gray she'd always had felt cold and impersonal, the old warm tones erased so completely that the house smelled faintly of latex and finality. She tried to master confusion with confidence, stepping further inside as if ownership could be reasserted through movement alone, but the silence stopped her short. Not the normal quiet of an empty house, but something curated, deliberate, as if noise itself had been evicted. I didn't rush to explain anything, because explanations imply negotiation, and I was long past that. I walked to the kitchen, ground coffee beans with slow, even pressure, and pour hot water like it was any other morning, because routine has a way of stripping drama out of moments that beg for it. She hovered near the doorway, still holding that unfamiliar suitcase, her smile thinning as she noticed the lack of her things, the absence of her scent, the way the house no longer responded to her presence. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady, almost gentle, and I told her she should sit down, that we weren't alone, and that she should be mindful of what she said next. The words landed harder than shouting ever could, because they forced her to look around again, really look, and recognize that the house had shifted allegiance while she was gone. Her confidence fractured in real time, shoulders tightening, breath becoming shallow, the practiced calm draining from her face as she realized this wasn't a conversation she controlled. She asked nothing, said nothing, just stood there listening to hum of the refrigerator and the distant tick of the clock, the same clock I kept all these years, now sounding less like background noise and more like a countdown, She could no longer stop Lauren follow me into the living room with the cautious steps of someone entering unfamiliar territory, even though she spent years arranging that space to her liking. And the moment she saw the woman seated in my old leather chair, the last traces of her retreat, composure vanished. Rachel Monroe didn't look up right away, didn't scramble to her feet or offer an apology for occupying a seat that had always been understood as mine. She simply sat there with her legs crossed, a legal pad resting neatly on her knee, posture calm, expression unreadable. That chair had molded itself to my body over the years, the left armrest worn smooth from where my hand always rested, and seeing someone else in it felt intentional, like a boundary drawn without needing words. Lauren stopped short, confusion flashing across her face before morphing into irritation, then disbelief, and finally something sharper, when Rachel slowly lifted her gaze and met Lauren's eyes without a hint of deference. I didn't introduce them right away, because introductions imply parody, and this was not that kind of moment. Rachel remained seated, composed, her presence steady in a way that made the room feel anchored, while Lauren's grip tightened on the handle of her suitcase, as if it were the only solid thing left. She glanced at me, clearly waiting for an explanation, for some reassurance that this was temporary or misunderstood, but I stayed where I was, leaning against the doorframe, letting silence do what it does best. Rachel closed her pen, placed it carefully on the pad, and still did not stand, a small but deliberate act that drained the last of Lauren's assumed superiority. The glow she'd walked in with, that carefully cultivated aura of enlightenment and self-assurance, evaporated as reality set in, replaced by shallow breaths and darting eyes as she tried to recalibrate. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, realizing too late that this wasn't a situation she could talk her way through, and that whatever version of events she'd rehearsed no longer mattered. Panic crept in quietly, visible in the tension of her jaw and the way her shoulders pulled inward, because for the first time since she'd walked back into the house, she understood she wasn't the one setting the terms, and the woman in the chair had been placed there to make sure of it. I told Lauren to sit down the same way I would have told a junior investigator to take a seat before a briefing. Not sharp, not loud, just firm enough that resistance felt pointless, and after a brief hesitation, she lowered herself onto the edge of the sofa, still clutching that suitcase like it could anchor her to a version of the day that no longer existed. Rachel waited until Lauren was seated before speaking, which was deliberate, because control isn't about speed, it's about timing, and when she finally introduced herself, her voice was calm, professional, and unyielding as she stated that she represented me, nothing more, nothing less. The words landed with a weight Lauren clearly hadn't prepared for, because representation meant preparation, documentation, forethought, and suddenly this wasn't a domestic disagreement or an emotional ambush she could reframe with tears or deflection. I stayed standing, positioned where I could see both of them, because distance matters, and from there the room felt less like a living space and more like a contained environment where variables had already been accounted for. Lauren tried to laugh it off at first, a short, brittle sound that didn't quite leave her throat, but Rachel didn't react, didn't smile or frown, simply opened her folder and rested it on her lap, without flipping a single page, making it clear that the contents existed whether they were revealed or not. I could see the shift happen then. The moment Lauren realized this wasn't about what was going to be said next, but about what had already been established before she walked through the door. No accusations were voiced, no evidence was laid out, yet the boundaries were unmistakable. Legal on one side, emotional on another, psychological on all fronts, closing in with quiet efficiency. I watched Lauren's posture change as the room seemed to tighten around her, shoulders slumping slightly, chin lifting in a reflexive attempt at dignity that no longer had anything to stand on. Rachel explained the purpose of her presence in measured terms, that this conversation would remain structured, that interruptions wouldn't be productive, that clarity was a goal, not conflict, and with every sentence the space for improvisation shrank further. Lauren looked at me then, searching my face for some hint of the man she'd left behind days earlier, but what she found instead was someone who had already moved past the need for confrontation, someone who had replaced emotion with procedure. By the time Rachel closed her folder again, without ever opening it, the trap had already closed, politely, cleanly, and without a single word needing to be spoken about why I opened the black folder slowly and set it on the coffee table between us, not for dramatic effect, but because rushing invites interruption, and I wanted every movement to feel intentional, controlled, irreversible. The folder wasn't thick because of chaos or obsession. It was thick because lives expand when you align them chronologically, and once they're ordered they stop being stories and start being timelines. I flipped it open and began laying things out in sequence, not sliding pages toward Lauren, just turning them so she could see, because denial requires distance and I wasn't giving her any. The retreat dates were first, Neatly printed schedules paired with location confirmations that never matched where her phone had actually been. Meditation centers in Oregon overlapping with cell pings from downtown hotels 2 states away. Silence retreats somehow coinciding with bar charges and valet fees. Then came mileage logs from her car, numbers that told their own quiet story, round trips that made no sense unless you knew exactly where someone was going and who they were meeting, distances too precise to be accidental. I moved on to hotel receipts, not just one or two but pattern, the same boutique chains, the same room types, always booked for 2 nights, always checked out early, always paid with a card she'd sworn we closed years ago. That card had its own section, statements highlighted, expenses categorized, a secret line of credit she'd maintained, the kind of care usually reserved for things you're terrified of losing. Rachel remained silent as I turned the pages, letting the evidence speak, letting the room absorb the weight of what was no longer deniable. Then I placed the final document on top, the one that made Lauren's breathing hitch despite her best effort to stay composed, a business account registered under an LLC she'd never mentioned, jointly held with Evan Brooks, deposits matching the timing of every supposed retreat, withdrawals matching hotels, the dinners, the weekends that were never spiritual at all. I didn't say Evan's name out loud at first, because I didn't need to. His presence was already stamped across the paper in black ink and transaction codes. The last pages were stills from surveillance, dates and times embedded cleanly in the corners. Lauren entering hotels she claimed not to remember the names of, Evan always a step behind or ahead, close enough to be unmistakable, far enough to look practiced. By the time I closed the folder, the lies had stopped being explanations and started being evidence, every retreat reduced to a plotted point on a map she hadn't realized I'd been drawing for months, and the room felt very still, not tense, just settled, like a conclusion that had finally arrived. I reached for my phone without looking at her and connected it to the speaker on the side table, the same one we use for music on weekends, and the familiarity of the device made what followed feel even more final. I told her I was going to play something, not as a warning, just as a statement of fact, because warnings invite arguments, and I wasn't interested in those anymore. When I pressed play, the room filled with her voice, clear and unmistakable, recorded weeks earlier inside this very house, casual and unguarded in the way people only are when they believe they're unseen. She was laughing, not nervously, not defensively, but freely, mocking the way I organized my days, joking about how predictable I was, how easy it was to let me think her retreats were about growth while she enjoyed the stability I provided. I watched her face as her own words spilled out, heard the sharp inhale when the recording reached the part where she said she didn't respect me anymore, that she stayed because comfort was easier than honesty, that I was useful even if I wasn't desirable. There was no anger in her tone on recording, no bitterness, just a cold, amused certainty that cut deeper than shouting ever could. I let it play longer than she wanted, long enough for every excuse she might have prepared to disintegrate under the weight of her own voice, confirming what I already knew. When the audio ended, I didn't rush to stop the silence that followed, because silence after truth is different. It doesn't beg to be filled. Lauren stared at the floor, her hands clenched together, lips parted like she wanted to speak, but couldn't find a version of events that survived what she'd just heard. There was nothing left for her to deny, no misunderstanding to correct, no narrative to reshape, because the proof hadn't come from me or from documents or from timelines. It had come from her, recorded in a moment she thought would never matter. I disconnected the phone and set it back where it belonged, feeling a strange calm settle in as the last trace of resistance drained from her posture. The denial didn't collapse loudly or dramatically. It simply ceased to exist, leaving behind the quiet certainty that the truth had finally been spoken, even if it hadn't been spoken to her face at the time. Rachel spoke next, and unlike everything before, this wasn't something I had lived through knowingly, which made it land differently, heavier in a way I hadn't anticipated. She didn't look at Lauren when she began. Instead, she looked at her notes, grounding the room in dates and facts before lifting her eyes and stating that this pattern hadn't started recently, that it reached back decades to a time I'd always remembered as a confusing but ordinary heartbreak. She referenced my previous relationship, the one that had ended abruptly years before I met Lauren, the woman who had slowly pulled away from me after a series of anonymous messages, half-truths, and carefully timed doubts that I'd never been able to explain. As Rachel spoke, the pieces rearranged themselves in my head, memories I'd written off as bad luck suddenly gaining sharp edges, the late-night arguments fueled by information neither of us could trace, the way trust had eroded without a clear source. Rachel explained calmly how Lauren had inserted herself then, not overtly, but patiently, positioning herself as understanding, supportive, safe, while quietly dismantling what stood in her way through anonymous emails, planted rumors, and emotional manipulation designed to look like coincidence. She detailed how the communications had been traced years later during an unrelated case, how writing patterns and digital fingerprints had matched Lauren with enough certainty that the conclusion was unavoidable. I felt something cold settle in my chest as I realized that what I'd always believed was a painful twist of fate had actually been engineered, that my grief back then had been part of a longer strategy rather than a moment of chance. Lauren didn't interrupt, didn't protest, because there was nothing theatrical left to offer, just a tightening of her jaw and a stare fixed somewhere past the floor as the narrative she'd built her life on was stripped of its innocence. Rachel finished by stating plainly that this wasn't a lapse in judgment or a moment of weakness, but a consistent method, a lifelong pattern of calculated control that had finally surfaced because patterns always do when they're documented long enough. I didn't feel anger in that moment, just a dull clarity, the kind that comes when you realize the person you trusted hadn't changed over time. They'd simply been consistent in ways you never knew to look for. The agreement was already waiting on the table when Rachel slid forward, crisp, final, every page aligned with the same care I'd used my entire career. And when Lauren saw it, her face tightened in a way that told me she already knew there would be no bargaining left. Rachel explained the terms without embellishment, that the separation was effective immediately, that alimony was not applicable given the documentation of concealed assets in bad faith, that personal items would be collected under supervision, and that Lauren had 48 hours to vacate the property permanently. Lauren tried once, quietly, to apologize, not with words of accountability, but with a familiar softening of her voice, the tone she used when she wanted something to stop hurting her, and I shut it down by saying nothing at all, because acceptance requires consent, and she no longer had mine. She signed where she was instructed, hands unsteady, ink bleeding slightly into the paper like proof of pressure, and when she stood up the house didn't seem to respond to her movement anymore. No creak of recognition, no sense of belonging. Rachel closed her folder, rose from the chair, and informed Lauren that she would be escorted while she gathered essentials, and that any further communication would go through legal channels only. Watching Lauren walk through rooms she once curated felt strange, like observing a former tenant relearn the layout of a place they no longer owned, touching nothing, glancing at walls that no longer carried her presence. When the door finally closed behind her, the sound wasn't dramatic, just clean, definitive, and for the first time in years the silence that followed didn't feel hollow or tense. It felt accurate. I stood alone in the living room, the chair empty again, the air unpolluted by rehearsed calm or hidden intentions, and the house felt honest in a way it never had before, quiet without deception, still without waiting, entirely mine at last.